Auto-critique, certainly, we all have to do that. I'm getting on a plane to leave this conference. But also critique of the system that tells us you are flawed, you are a fundamentally failed object of a person, but you can get over your opioid-induced constipation that comes from your bad back from standing giving keynotes by taking this pill, and then everything will be better. That the operation of US advertising is a system founded on a fundamentally reactionary notion of you as a flawed subject. Get rid of these marks on your skin. Get rid of this odor. Your life will be better. Now, this operates worldwide, but having just come back to live in New Orleans, I'm staggered by the way that people in this country are told every single day, every hour on commercial TV, that they are, to use that technical term, fucked. So let's start talking about that model of ethical incompleteness that derives from the German Romantics and say, we don't want it actually, thank you very much. And we don't need to consume so much in order to compensate for this sense of a failed self. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Toby, and UC, wherever he is. I just have one announcement reminding you to sign up for a bus that's going to be taking us up to the Japanese garden. That's at the registration desk. Thank you for being here, and we'll have a break and then go into our parallel panels. And that's it. Thank you.
types of genres and modes, expanding into audience, production, and infrastructure studies, and then beginnings of expanding beyond Western and US and European cinema. So in terms of theory, the touchstone piece for, I think many of you know this for the field, is probably Scott McDonald's 2004 essay, Toward an Eco-Cinema. McDonald is a practitioner of a studier of avant-garde cinema. He's written many books and lots of articles on avant-garde and independent film. And in that piece, he turned it toward ecological issues. And he argued that certain kinds of ecologically focused cinema can draw the viewer's gaze, create a sense of attention, and perhaps even change people's minds about the environment, change their perceptions. Paula Willicat-Mercandi took up that in her book, Framing the World, and that became sort of the theoretical underpinnings of that book. That kind of philosophy has generated a lot of great work. Screening Nature, a book that came out a couple of years ago, follows along that trajectory. But there's also been some important challenges to that sense that certain films are eco-films. And I think one of the best examples of that challenge is a piece that David Ingram wrote for Eco-Cinema Theory and Practice, in which he looks into cognitive film theory and argues that any film can be looked at from an environmental perspective. So as the field has developed, we've seen that very nice blend, I think, of people who want to look at particular kinds of texts and argue that particular kinds of texts do particular things for viewers and audiences, and then a group of scholars who are expanding the notion of really using eco-criticism or environmental criticism to look at all kinds of film and media. And that has allowed the field to flourish, that productive disagreement. You also see over the last decade or so work by Adrian Ivakiv, who has attempted to lay out a very sort of fully engaged ecological philosophy of motion pictures in his work. Some of our keynote speakers, actually, Parika and Miller, have both done work in different ways, expanding the field's sense of theory, and Miller and Maxwell into environmental waste, into production studies, and things like that. And last year's keynote speaker, one of last year's keynote speakers, Sean Cubitt, as well. There's also been a very strong urge toward wildlife cinema and non-human animals, and theorizing the role that other critters play in film and media texts. Cynthia Chris's Watching Wildlife, probably the most prominent from about 2006. But Jen Ladino's work has been terrific in this respect, and also Claire Malloy's recent book, which is absolutely fantastic. More and more stuff keeps coming out, right? Alexa Wiekman-Mosner's work on affect in cinema, Nicole Seymour's work on queer cinema and just queering the idea of what we consider eco-criticism. Pat Brereton has a recent book on environmental ethics and approaching film and media from that point of view. And Adam O'Brien's recent book, which is primarily a look at the new Hollywood period of the 1970s in American cinema. One of the things that O'Brien's book brings in is a very strong emphasis on looking back at early film theorists and bringing eco-criticism, which sort of emerged separately from media criticism, trying to bring those two worlds in together in very productive ways. So there's a lot of room for folks interested in philosophy and theory to continue to expand the field in those ways. In terms of audience production and infrastructure, also lots and lots of great work. I think one of the things that keeps coming up in our field is this sense that we need to learn more about who's watching media texts, who's consuming media texts, who's recirculating media texts. Pietari Kappa edited or co-edited a an issue of interactions that included several pieces of work on audience studies, one of which was quite strong, I felt, was Pat Brereton's. They used Q research or Q method to try to quantify audience interaction a little bit in audience analysis. Um, but there's also the collection on Avatar has a piece on audience, and there's some interesting work out there on Food Incorporated as well. So lots and lots of work, but any of you who are looking for collaborations, particularly with the social scientists, maybe as Toby mentioned, I would encourage you to continue to find ways to take stock of what audiences are making out of film and media text. In terms of genres and in terms of modes, scholars have been working in recent years on building off early work about 10 or so years ago on the Western and on animated films, more recently have pushed their attention toward eco-horror. That's become a hot issue the last couple of years. Eco-comedy. And then our book, there's another book that came out about the same time by Janet Walker and Nicole Starosielski. Both of those books, you see people pushing the envelopes into radio, comic books, television, video games, data visualization, transmedia, social media, and galactic media or atmospheric media, or what I think Bob's calling ecospheric media, which I'm really looking forward to. We're also expanding beyond the Western world. There's work in screening nature on Thai cinema. There's, of course, the fantastic collection out there, Transnational Eco-Cinema, the Chinese Eco-Cinema book, which I'm hoping will receive an update in the near future. But also several Chinese journals are, there's a lot of work coming out in China right now on eco-media. And then, of course, Salma's work on indigenous eco-cinema, which we're going to hear about in a little bit. The one last area I think that we've made real progress in is in infrastructure and production studies. Maxwell and Miller have been really inspirational here, but also Lisa Parks and Nicole Starosielski, both of whom come out of the UC Santa Barbara School. Parks is still there. Starosielski has moved on to, I think she's at NYU still right now. Starosielski's latest books have been on underwater cables in cinema, and now I forget the brand new one that's coming out, but she's gone in a new direction as well, which is really interesting. Natalie Bozak has given us a way of thinking about whether digital cinema is a more appropriate means of production in an era in which the carbon footprint of the film and media industry has become under question. And Hunter Vaughn at Oakland University is right now writing a book on production in the classical Hollywood era, and he's taking an eco-production or eco-materialist look at that as well. So be looking for that book to come out. Some new challenges. So where do I think we're going from here? First of all, I think that we want to keep exploring as many different kinds of film and media texts as we can, and contexts, and production contexts. When I was thinking about what to present, for example, at this year's upcoming Association for Literature and Environment Conference in Detroit in June, I realized that no one seems to be writing about anti-environmentalist work. I looked at Helen Hughes' book on green documentary. There are no anti-green documentaries mentioned in the book. And with the shitstorm that has hit us in terms of our own federal administration in this country, I want to be thinking about, we tend to really blow off people who don't get it, or who aren't convinced by an inconvenient truth, or who aren't convinced by environmental media texts. We think that there's something sort of wrong with them or wrong-headed with them. And I'm using my own mother-in-law here. She and I have been talking quite a bit. She's a nurse. She's a college-educated person, brilliant person, absolutely convinced that climate change is a hoax perpetrated by the scientific community. And she's given me a lot of great materials from the perspective of the climate change denial films and things like that. So I'm really interested in us taking those kinds of things seriously and treating those audiences as thinking, rational people who are simply using their ideological frames to think through those kinds of things. I think that we need to do a lot more work on early cinema. I think that looking back to the teens, looking back to the very early 1900s, thinking about what Edison and the Lumieres were doing in the 1890s in terms of film is a very understudied aspect of environmental film and media. Part of getting to that is the second new challenge, which is forging interdisciplinary conversations. The fact that those of us up here come from different disciplines, and when you look at the program that they put together for the What is Life conference, should be the model for what we do going forward. Many times, because I have attended several different kinds of conferences, you find that people, for example, who go to the Society for Cinema and Media Studies conference don't really talk to the folks who present always at the Association for the Study of Literature and Environment conference. And those folks don't always talk to the people presenting at the environmental communications conferences. There are some keynote people and people at the sort of upper echelon, I think, of our field who are doing that, but at the lower level, we're still sort of repeating some of the conversations that we should have. So Lillian's work, for example, I've thought a lot since I came here last year and saw one of the keynotes present on media ecology, a field which really does not mention environmental ecology very often. And so I'm excited to hear your thoughts on nature and technology and continuing to bridge those gaps from a communications perspective. Three more quick points. A continued global focus. Özma Derci and Manani's essay for Ecomedia Key Issues on Turkish cinema, I think, was groundbreaking in terms of getting into the Middle Eastern cinema. We have a presenter here this week who's not with us today, Jason, who is going to be presenting on Philippine cinema and media, and the opportunities for continued expansion are absolutely fantastic. We had a unique collaboration for our last book between two scholars, Diana Oliveira and Lauren Woolbright, who combined their interest in Mexican video games and Brazilian video games. And I think that if we can expand both in terms of genre and mode and expand outward, I think I saw a recent call for papers for a book on African cinema. That is one very understudied area for environmental film and media. Environmental justice is another issue that we need to look more at going forward. There's been some amazing, amazing work on blackfish that has combined both a sort of an animal justice perspective, but also an environmental, human perspective, combining, as kind of Toby wants us to do, the anthropocentric and the ecocentric a little bit more. But I'd like to see more work on Syrian cinema or Iranian cinema, whatever media we can find coming out of Syria, coming out of the Middle East, particularly in relationship to the refugee crisis. Because in a few years, if we think the Syrian refugee crisis is a serious issue, just wait for what's coming when waves of climate refugees begin making their way out of low-lying parts of the world. I think a little bit more work needs to be done on disability studies, transgender studies. Nicole's work on queer studies has been groundbreaking, but it needs to be followed up with more and more work in that field as well. And also thinking about the environmental justice in areas where we have folks who don't consider themselves under the threat of environmental justice. In my own neck of the woods and in our own neck of the woods here, that is perhaps the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge story, the actual armed takeover of that location. A lot of great media coverage has been produced about that event. I would like to see something like that analyzed from an environmental perspective as well. Finally, And because our chair's not here, I hope I haven't gone way over time. In terms of pedagogy, I think I'm right at about 20 minutes or so. Antonio Lopez, who's with us here, has been, in some ways, although he might not see it that way, as someone who's been watching it, I see Antonio in some ways as being a little bit like, come here, like pay attention to this, right? What the hell's going on? We all write about this stuff all the time, and many of us are teaching this stuff all the time, but there aren't a lot of opportunities to write about teaching environmental film and media. I was fortunate enough to, I think because I teach at the same school as Stephanie Lemenager, to be part of a teaching climate change in the humanities collection that came out a year or two ago. But we need more work on that. I went to SCMS last year and presented with like a stellar lineup, including Paula Villiquet-Maricandi, who is now a dean at Champlain College. And we had this fantastic lineup of people talking about how they teach environmental film and media, and a very, very small audience of people came to attend. And I know that is part of how conferences work. But to me, that was a sign that we need to consider this as seriously as we take media archaeology and other things. At my own school, at the U of O, we have not yet greened our film production program. We have a growing cinema studies program. We have over 400 majors now. There is, despite some of my attempts, which is hard as a non-tenure track person, to engage people in this conversation, very little interest in taking the greening of the actual production classes seriously. We use an enormous amount of power and electricity. We go through cameras probably too quickly. We go through computers more quickly than we should because we're always trying to keep up with the latest and greatest technology. And there's no sort of central accountability for how we recycle those things, for how we treat our own e-waste. And that's something that I even encountered for a piece that I wrote on, I was writing about bringing media ecology and environmental media studies together, and I got to speak to the makers of a film called Ghana Digital Dumping Ground, which was produced for Frontline on PBS. They tracked some of their own computers to these digital dumping grounds in Ghana and in China outside of Hong Kong. And yet when I asked them what they did with their own cameras after they were finished, they couldn't answer me. They didn't really know what happened to them. They had no sense for how to account for those things. And so even those of us who are studying this need to take more seriously our own footprint. And my last call is to support more adjunct work, adjunct research, non-tenure track research. Those of you who teach at research facilities who have adjuncts and non-tenure track instructors, they receive almost no financial support. They're often treated as second-class citizens by faculty members, and they're doing some of the best research out there. And so that's my final call, is for you to encourage your colleagues and to support them as much as you can. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your paper. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for having me. My name is Lillian. I am a grad student at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. I'm in the School of Communication there. Although I'm sorry, I might disappoint you. This is not necessarily going to be coming from a communication perspective. My background is in political science and social and political thought, so it's going to sort of be a theory paper, so I apologize if that's not something that excites you.
It does.
I'm glad to hear that then. Also, I should say, so this is a very small part of my larger project, and so if there are things that I sort of gloss over, I apologize for that. But I'm really just looking for feedback, and I would really appreciate any constructive criticism or suggestions. With that said, I'll just start. So dualism is not a philosophically defensible position. Uh, One needs to look no further than René Descartes to demonstrate this. He isolates the mind in order to discover the truth about it, but ends up finding himself in the impossible situation of explaining how the mind, an immaterial thing, interacts with the body, a material thing. The problem with this is his theory will never be able to explain reality because it is theorized without taking everyday experience into account. In fact, he ends up rationalizing the idea that his mind might not even exist, or that his body might not even exist. He ends up justifying this position that is in direct contradiction to what we know to be true and to what science tells us. While we may be able to forgive Descartes for not being able to think beyond his time, we do not have that luxury today. Science and scientists are telling us that climate change is a real thing, that it is human caused, and that we are at a critical moment to try and stop the worst from occurring. So why do we continue to rationalize our current organization of human relations and our current mode of production and consumption? This paper will explore and answer this question by attempting to parse through another dualism that is prevalent in capitalist society, that of nature and technology. It has occurred to me, and I'm sure it's occurred to many of you, that nature and technology operate as polar opposites in their everyday usage. If we are discussing technology, or even society for that matter, we are not talking about anything natural. We are talking about something artificial or something made that ultimately ends up overcoming some aspect of nature that presents itself as inconvenient, whether it's distance, time, the weather, or our own bodies. However, this ultimately ignores the fact that this technology can only exist based on our understanding of nature, and that this technology, that is produced mostly through capitalist relations, will constantly be updated and somehow gotten rid of. That is, it has to go back to somewhere, and it ends up going back to this earth. We don't really end up taking into account the impact that it will have. Conversely, when we talk about nature, we are referring to something that exists outside of society and thus technology, even though nature is everywhere in everything. Nature ends up being a symbol for authenticity rather than being understood as constitutive of our life processes. So this paper will articulate the Marxist conception of nature, the theory of reification as articulated by Georg Lukács, to explain the role of capital in maintaining the many dualisms in capitalist society, and then shift to an articulation of a social constructionist view of nature as articulated by Stephen Vogel. It will conclude that understanding each as non-binary, we can reconstruct the relationship between nature and technology that does not reproduce this dualism, as dualisms only help to perpetuate the logic of capital and the damage that comes with it to the earth. So we can see Marx's understanding of nature in his discussion of alienated labor in the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844. For Marx, nature is, quote, the sensuous external world. It is the material in which labor is realized, in which it is active, and from which and by means of which it's produced. He describes the process of alienation whereby human individuals are alienated from the products of their labor that then come to dominate them, humans, that is, but emphasizes that this process also alienates humans from nature. Marx is clearly not trying to maintain any dualisms between humans and nature or humans and society when he says, man lives from nature, and we can maybe forgive him for using the man as referencing humans. Maybe. Man lives from nature, that is, nature is his body, and he must maintain a continuing dialogue with it if he is not to die. But the further implication of this is that alienated labor is what begins to create the separation between humans and nature at the expense of the survival of society and possibly even nature. This alienation is embedded in our labor process, and so it's embedded in the technology that our labor produces. And further, it is embedded in the fixed capital or dead labor that is required to produce new commodities, so any sort of technology that's required to then produce other sorts of commodities. It is necessary to sell our labor power in order to live, because it costs money to live, and it is this inability to access what is necessary to reproduce our lives without money, it is the structural separation of humans and nature and the way that the separation seems natural that perpetuates this dualism between nature and society and consequently nature and technology. We can see this further when looking at Lukács's understanding of reification, which is the mistaking of social relations for objects. Capitalism ends up presenting the world as a collection of concrete, discrete facts. Capitalism is in fact a science built on these facts. However, it is only one interpretation of the facts and actually fundamentally mystifies them, as the objectivity and appearance of these facts do not take into account the social processes that were necessary to bring them into existence. This sort of mystification is even built into our education system, as I think you pointed out, and the way that we study the world. The natural sciences like physics, chemistry, and biology are separated from human sciences like political science or sociology, which are separated from the study of language and so on. Even through our education, we naturalize the splitting up of a world that we encounter all at once. In this way, capitalist production is also a process of continuous reproduction, in that it reproduces commodity surplus value and the relations themselves of capitalist and laborer, literally reproducing the world and the relations that constitute it. In a world organized by capitalist principles, the economic relations that directly determine the metabolic exchange between man and nature progressively disappear. This is a quote from Lukács. Man becomes, in the true sense of the word, a social being. Nature becomes the reality for man. By reproducing the world through capitalist principles, certain relationships become less salient. We end up rationalizing this organization of the world based on the fact that it already exists, without looking at alternative possibilities or what dangers exist within this configuration. Lukács's discussion of the metabolic exchange between man and nature here becomes really important because this describes one of the most fundamental and taken for granted contradictions that capitalism is predicated on. The natural world has a finite amount of resources and has its own processes, and human life takes place within these limits, but capitalism requires the unfettered, unending, uninterrupted use of these resources in order to make a profit. It is not possible to sustain perpetual growth when the material of value, which is nature, is finite. Following Marx, Lukács understands nature as, quote, the material foundation of knowledge, and that the economic structure of society always mediates the relationship between nature and humans. In other words, the economic structure of society, quote, determines the stage of development of the exchange of matter between nature and society, and from that results the stage of development of the knowledge of nature. This exchange is dependent on a correct knowledge of nature to some degree. However, this maintains that with regards to the discussion above about capitalism and reification, our knowledge of nature and our relationship is mediated by capitalism. Further, if nature is seen through the lens of capitalist reproduction, it no longer is seen as that from which society has arisen. It becomes the material of value which must be extracted in order to make a profit. It is turned into an instrument rather than being understood as the context in which society exists and as that which makes society possible. This is all to say that capitalism has a tendency to treat things as separate when really they are interconnected. This corresponds to the understanding of technology that could arguably come from Heidegger. So again, while he was clearly a Nazi, maybe we should not discount the interesting and intriguing things that he's contributed to in terms of conceptualizing nature and technology. So while he's not discussing these problems as arising from capitalism, the argument lends itself to the critique of capitalism very nicely. In his essay, The Question Concerning Technology, he argues that the essence of modern technology is in framing, which is the tendency to reduce everything in its view as standing reserve. He explains standing reserve as a way of ordering or a way of organizing in view of the world where, quote, the energy concealed in nature is unlocked, what is unlocked is transformed, what is transformed is stored up, what is stored up is in turn distributed, and what is distributed is switched about ever anew. It is clear that this enframing is nothing technological, and it is not simply a result of human action. It is when human beings make an attempt to understand the natural physical world in a way where the world is then revealed as standing reserve, so that we can order it in a different way to reveal the potentiality that exists. This is what all science is built upon. In order to build a functioning airplane, we must understand how the laws of physics work, and the raw materials that exist on the Earth that can then be transformed and put together in a way that will allow us to use this knowledge for a specific purpose, which in this case is to fly. If it is human action that catalogs this, but is not simply the result of human action, we must have the knowledge of what kinds of things exist in the world in order for us to reveal the potentiality within them. The danger of this, as Heidegger points out, however, is when we stop considering what is being revealed as some object with many inherent potentialities, with many of them, but only as standing reserve, where certain potentialities are being cultivated at the expense of others. It is at this point when even human beings are also considered to be standing reserve, like, for instance, when we are considered to be labor power, potential labor power, for instance, in capitalism. However, Heidegger says, quote, "In technology's essence roots and thrives the saving power, and that we must continue to confront modern technology, quote, in a realm that is, on the one hand, akin to the essence of technology, and on the other, fundamentally different from it." While he poses this other realm as the realm of art, I actually think that this answer is nature. It is nature that has the same root as technology, and as discussed above, in that functioning technology is simply an application of our knowledge and understanding of the laws of nature and the material of the natural world. But it is fundamentally different. The concept of nature put forth by Stephen Vogel in his book Thinking Like a Mall captures the necessity to dissolve this dualism between nature and technology by understanding both as socially constructed. So in Thinking Like a Mall, Vogel discusses the necessity to get rid of the separation between what is natural and what is social. He advocates for an understanding of nature that is socially constructionist, and by this he means, quote, referring to the active physical, socially, and normatively organized processes through which we build the environment we inhabit. Social construction, that is, should be meant literally. To say that X is socially constructed would mean that socially organized human beings have built X through processes of labor. A social constructionist view of nature, therefore, is more about the environment that we live in as a whole, and not just the things we understand to be natural, such as animals, forests, or the weather. He advocates for this because most conceptions of nature that one would encounter, even in environmentalist circles, are idealist or are conceptual abstractions. Bill McKibben, a well-known environmentalist, wrote a book called The End of Nature, where he laments the fact that there is no such thing as untouched nature and that humans have ruined nature. But as Vogel points out, if nature has already ended, what are environmentalists trying to save or protect? This is where the problem of dualism becomes clear. In order to have a sustainable future, we need to stop reproducing these sorts of dualisms that continue to mystify the relations that define us.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Bob Jensen. I teach in the School of Journalism at the University of Texas in Austin. And I am not going to read the paper I brought with me. I'll explain what that is and encourage people who might want to read it to just come up afterwards, give me an email address, and I'll send the text to you. But then I want to go on and talk about some other things. The paper, though, is part of a larger project I'm involved in that is going under the term ecospheric studies right now. It's housed at the Land Institute, which is that familiar to anyone? The Land Institute, Salina, Kansas. A very exciting place where they're doing research on sustainable agriculture that I think is one of the most promising avenues in agriculture. But the president of the Land Institute just recently retired is a man named Wes Jackson. And if you don't take anything else away from my contribution here, write that down, Wes Jackson, and go read some of Wes's work. But Wes, in his new phase after letting go of leadership of the Land Institute, is rethinking ecological education and environmental studies. He's actually one of the people who helped found environmental studies 50 years ago, starting in his teaching in California. Created one of the first environmental studies programs and now thinks it's gone off the rails and needs to be rethought. And so there's a group of us working with Wes on this, and the paper I have is a type of manifesto for the Ecospheric Studies project. But because I don't like to read papers, I thought I would talk about some things that have been on my mind since last night when I got here, and especially during the keynotes this morning. I'm going to introduce this with a couple of lines from a favorite poem of mine by Wendell Berry, a name that might be more familiar. If not, write that one down too, Wendell Berry, who's sort of the poet laureate of the sustainable ag movement. He's got a lovely poem called How to Be a Poet, which I always read as How to Be a Human Being, because I've never written a poem in my life. And I take great inspiration from that, however. And in How to Be a Poet, Wendell says, "There are no unsacred places. There are only sacred places and desecrated places." And I remember when I first read that, I got a bit of a chill. I still do every time I think about it. There are no unsacred places in the world. There are only sacred places and desecrated places, which speaks to this dualism, I think, that Lillian just described. And that brings me to the organizing principle for my remarks, which is the question of grief. Because I think when we talk about the ecosphere, when we talk about the multiple cascading ecological crises we face, one thing we don't talk enough about is grief. And I think I would like to put grief in the center of this. That if we cannot collectively grieve and talk about that process, I think we are morally lost. And that is not easy to do in a society obsessed with solutions. Yes? If you start to identify problems, there's always some asshole in the room, and if that asshole is here today, I'm marking you as such without apology. That was a joke, I'm kidding. Yeah, thank you for laughing. Somebody who will say, okay, we all know the problem, can you give us some solutions? And I really think that is part of the problem, this obsession with solutions, for several reasons. One is when people say we know the problem, actually they typically don't know the problem. They don't understand the scope of the problem. And the move quickly to solutions has, I think, two main problems. One is that typically solutions are assumed to be solutions within existing systems that will allow us to keep living the way we live. When people say we need solutions, what they mean is we need solutions that don't actually make us deal with reality. And solutions therefore become an impediment. They always assume we're going to stay on this current trajectory we were on. The second reason I don't like the obsession with solutions is that I think it leapfrogs over this grieving that we need to do. It's a form of grief denial. And this solutionism, that's actually a term that Garel Perovitz uses to talk about this obsession, is all rooted in the most dangerous fundamentalism currently loose in the world today. There's a lot of fundamentalisms in the world. We talk mostly about religious fundamentalism, whether it's Islamic or Christian or in Judaism. There's a lot of religious fundamentalism around, really dangerous stuff. When people are convinced of the certainty of their own conclusions, typically bad things happen. I live in the United States where there's a lot of national fundamentalism, the assumption that the United States is always righteous in its pursuits. There's, of course, market fundamentalism, the fundamentalism of modern capitalism. But in some ways, the most dangerous fundamentalism is what people for now a few decades have been calling technological fundamentalism. The idea that any problems we face can be solved through high energy, high technology. What makes this fundamentalism particularly irrational is it's typically applied to the problems created by previous applications of high energy, high technology. So high energy, high technology produces unintended consequences, things like climate change, for instance, an ozone hole, these things. And so when we face problems created by high energy, high technology, we assume we will solve them with more high energy, high technology, which will, of course, if history holds, produce more unintended consequences and dig us deeper into the hole. Now, there are two, we don't want to demonize people. Yes, we do. We want to demonize people. Specifically, it's fun to demonize. It's fun to point to people and make fun of them and pretend they're evil. Yes? You're a very serious bunch. I'm trying to have some fun. Christ, it's a Friday morning in Portland. I walked here wondering if I was going to get, Jesus, you people are really very serious. Right? I'm going to give you two flip sides of the technological fundamentalist coin in the body of specific people. In a sense, not to demonize them, but to point at them, make fun of them a bit. One version of technological fundamentalism you can find in Rex Tillerson, of course, current Secretary of State, former ExxonMobil CEO, who, when asked about climate, he finally kind of conceded climate change, climate destabilization. It's a problem. But he described it as an engineering problem. Yes? Just something engineers will take care of. And we know where that leads to. It leads to one absolute indication of human insanity, geoengineering. Yes, this term now being used for how, if we can't slow global warming, we will engineer the climate, for instance, by shooting sulfate particles up into the atmosphere to reflect back sunlight. Nothing bad could happen there, I'm sure. Massive intervention into the global upper atmosphere, I'm sure it will work out just fine. If you wonder if people are insane, just go read the geoengineering stuff and you'll have your answer. All right. Another, I think, person who embodies this technological fundamentalism, who I love to poke fun at, is Al Gore. Probably the greatest impediment to rational thinking on the planet today. Al Gore, yes, Mr. Inconvenient Truth, who runs around explaining that the price of solar panels is going to come down to the point where everything's going to be taken care of. I watched a recent TED Talk, infuriating. Al Gore is just the liberal flip side of the conservative coin. The assertion that we can continue to live roughly the way we live, 7.4 billion people on this planet, with some of us consuming in the affluent sphere, others aspiring toward it, that the renewable energies are going to solve all of this, and that market forces will produce this. I think another indication of human insanity. All right. So these people, Rex Tillerson and Al Gore, they pride themselves on being realistic. Yes? They're solutions-based. They're realistic. And I think if we're going to deal with the world, we have to stop being realistic and start being honest. Because, in fact, there's nothing realistic about fantasy. And geoengineering is a fantasy, and renewable energy sustaining this world as we now live in it is a fantasy. And that if we're going to get through that, we inevitably have to start grieving for what has been lost and what will be lost. And that is not an easy thing to do. We all have experiences of struggling with our own grief individually, when we lose loved ones, for instance, but even more difficult to do it at the collective level around the issues we're talking about here. But I don't see any other option if we don't grieve. Let me put a finer point on it. I'm 58 years old, and for most of my life, my generation was told that the moral challenge was to feed the world. Yes? Those of us in the first world are doing okay, but we must feed the world. The language of industrial heroism, that's what West calls it. And that was our challenge. Yes. I no longer think that is the moral challenge for the human species. The moral challenge is, how are we going to deal with living through a great human die-off, which is what I think is the fate, maybe not of me, I might be old enough to get to the grave without this, but for much of humanity that's currently on the planet. how are we going to make sense of living if we do live in an affluent realm, relatively protected, at least for the time being, knowing, as Stephen pointed out, that climate refugees are going to be streaming out of those most vulnerable places, and that the world is simply not equipped to deal with that, and that we are going to live through an intensification of a process we already see unfolding. If you doubt this, I recommend a book now that's already about 4 or 5 years old, The Tropic of Chaos by Christian Parenti, which talks about the reality of this in low levels, which are only going to intensify. That's going to require a kind of grieving that we do collectively. Better to start the process now, it seems to me. All right, so that's a bit dire, so let me wrap up by trying to be, if not hopeful, at least helpful. It seems to me that in this project that we're talking about, there are always two tasks. One is to critique existing systems which are inconsistent with our own moral principles. Capitalism, for instance, system that needs endless critique because it's inconsistent with our own moral principles. Resistance is part of that. Resistance to the political and economic forces that structure the world. But in addition to critique, there's the process of reimagination and trying to live out alternatives, what political scientists call prefigurative politics, trying to create spaces in which we actually live alternatives. And although so far my remarks have been a bit grim, there are, I think, reasons to, as we grieve, also move forward. Grieving does not imply paralysis or abandonment of our obligations. And I want to talk about that at two different levels. One is a specific person, a man named Jim Coplin, who no one in the room will have ever heard of. He was a friend of mine, a former teacher, community organizer, and perhaps most important, farmer, gardener. Jim died about 4 years ago. He was 25 years older than me, but he was one of those people who lived in a way that dealt with the grief without giving up. I have always found Jim so inspirational that after he died, I wrote a book about him called Plain Radical. He's one of those people, quiet, behind the scenes, thoughtful, engaged in both that critique. He was part of political movements that resisted concentrations of wealth and power, but also part of that reimagination in communities where he lived, creating connections and spaces for an alternative. And so it's people like that who actually can dig in and do this work that we need to remember. At a larger level, I want to go back to Wes Jackson. There are, if the obsession with solutions is a distraction, it doesn't mean we don't need to think about how to change the world. And I think Wes's project at the Land Institute is one of the most inspiring. I won't go into great detail, but and Wes's own writing explains it as well as material on the Land Institute's website. But Wes pointed out about 40 years ago, when he was a environmental studies professor at one of the CSU campuses, that the problem of soil erosion was continuing despite considerable efforts to stem that. And soil erosion is in some ways as dire a problem as climate change. So Wes started thinking about the problem of agriculture, not problems in agriculture, but the problem of agriculture, the fact that as long as humans have been farming, we've been eroding the soil, eroding it well beyond replacement levels, which has only one ending, which is, of course, mass starvation. And so Wes started thinking about the problem of agriculture, especially in the modern industrial agriculture, of annual monocultures, farming by planting every year annual crops in monocultures. And the story he tells is quite interesting, but to sum up, he started thinking about what if we took nature as measure, a phrase he uses often, and tried to farm the way nature farms, metaphorically, which led him to the idea of perennial polycultures. In other words, moving from annual plants to perennial plants, which presents problems because perennials, of course, put a lot of their energy into roots, not seed. And so a breeding program, plant breeding program, was necessary to find out if we could have perennial grains that yielded at a level that could feed people. The problem of annuals was half the problem. It's also monoculture. So Wes said, what about the possibility of perennial grains grown in polycultures so that the problem of weeds, pests, and pathogens could be controlled naturally instead of through petrochemicals? And for 40 years at the land, they've been pursuing this question, and with now some considerable success. Recently, there's been a big infusion of funding and some really quite notable scientific breakthroughs that now mean that one of their perennial grains is about to go into commercial production, which is pretty exciting. But note that it took 40 years. One of Wes's phrases is, if you're working on something you can accomplish in your own lifetime, you're not thinking big enough. Right? So this short-term solutionism, right, that impedes our ability to rethink problems and to grieve. There are, in my life at least, real-world examples of how to challenge that. I want to go back to Wendell Berry, who is a source of great challenge to me and also often great comfort. That poem I quoted from, How to Be a Poet, there are no unsacred places. There are only sacred places and desecrated places. It's a theme Wendell comes back to over and over again in his own fiction and poetry. And it reminds me, and this is where I'll end, of a line from probably his most well-known book, which is called The Unsettling of America, which was written first, published in the 1970s, and was one of the first, coherent articulations of a rejection of industrial agriculture and a defense of rural community and sustainable farming methods. And in that, Wendell writes not only about how to farm, it's also about culture as much as agriculture, hence the subtitle of the book, Culture and Agriculture. And in that book, Wendell reminds us that we live on the human estate of grief and joy. And that in a society that's obsessed with pleasure, we need to distinguish between pleasure and joy. And that if we want to experience that deeper joy, there is no way to it without its companion grief. And so the pitch for grieving, people generally, let's go grieve. That sounds like a lot of fun. It's maybe counterintuitive to try to entice people into a movement for ecological awareness by promising them grief. But there is a way in which I think even people who don't articulate it feel it at a certain level. So part of the sales pitch is, you're feeling it anyway, why not feel it with other people? And also a reminder that without it, there is no possibility of joy in our lives. Thanks.
So we have the room for about 10 or 15 minutes if there are any questions, or just you want to call somebody out for being an asshole. things I can think of off the top of my head is somebody that I went through college with. Her name's Diana Martinez, and she recently graduated with her degree from the U of O, and took a position at an art cinema in Nebraska where she does public outreach and coordination. So I think anything that we can do at the cinemas themselves, it's going to be very difficult to get, for example, a large chain like Regal to change their popcorn roller coaster thing at the beginning. You know, you get the little recycle your 3D glasses thing. That's kind of helpful until you hear people laughing at the theater when it happens, but it's at least a start. At the art cinema, though, because the financial model is so dependent on community engagement, there are a lot of things that I think can happen at that level. Um, and you know, in general, in the public, things cost money, right? Public information campaigns cost money. And the film industry itself has been dealing, it started to deal with this around the time of The Inconvenient Truth, when people began to become more aware of how much waste happens on a movie set. The film and television industry has been sort of caught between this, like, how do we show the country or show consumers that we care without showing them what we actually do so much that we do care. And so I really think that in order for the public to become more engaged, this might be kind of skeptical, but I think market factors will have to be in place, right? Green consumerism is a very problematic thing because it leads to exactly the kind of binary thinking, and it leads to exactly the kind of solutionism that my two colleagues here have pointed out. But it can create massive change as well relatively quickly, as we see all the time. So that's at least some initial ideas. I'm hoping maybe one of you two has something a little bit more less money oriented.
No, nothing. You know, and to just to, I realize I don't want to be misunderstood. There's, I'm a big supporter of, you know, doing things like this that are useful, but with the recognition they are not a solution to the problem, but they cultivate the virtues, which are going to be a big part of whatever human community comes after this. Yes, and so I think anything that helps us live more sanely is a good thing, while also recognizing that the collection of us living more sanely will not stop the trajectory that we're on. And that's, I mean, there's a lot of, you know, this holding two things in your head at the same time and committing to doing it when it seems contradictory that we just have to get better at doing, I think.
I'm reminded too of an article that Van Jones wrote a few years ago called Green New Deal, where he writes about trying to bring together social justice activists with environmental activists and the religious community as well, right? Religious figures in this country and around the world have a very strong influence over people. And the more green pastors there are, the more that congregations can get the message of stewardship that way as well. But any time that we engage in political activism, whether it's feminist activism or whether it's race-based activism, I think that there are opportunities there, right? The Black Lives Matter movement should not just be considered a race-based movement. It is also very much an environmental justice movement as well. And I think that there are a lot of really fantastic on-the-ground activists out there who we can look to for leadership, more so than from academics.
Yeah, I was just going to say organizing is very important. So at SFU, this, it's like the environmental issue is very a hot topic at SFU currently because Kinder Morgan is trying to build a pipeline through the mountain that our main campus is on. And so something that we're trying to do is sort of organize against it, but also make sure that we, but also to sort of let the indigenous people that live like in the Coast Salish area. Like it's about sort of articulating these struggles together because we're all sort of fighting for an earth that will still exist, right? So that's sort of to sort of piggyback off of that. Yeah.
We have two questions.
Speaking of bringing movements together, even within the environmental movement, we have people who are climate change activists, and then we have the huge food and sustainable agriculture movement. And they are largely separated, although there's an extremely important link because organic agriculture, forestry, and so on is the only known way to draw down CO2 from the atmosphere, which we absolutely need to do. And so there's very little communication between, say, the West Jacksons and farmers markets and so on one side, and then 350.org and these people on the other side. And I think in eco-media, this would be a very valuable task. Just broadcast this, that the only way we know to bring down CO2 from the atmosphere is through the photosynthesis of plants and enriching the soil.
That's very well put. I don't know if eco-atmospherics has any of that connective thread to it. Is that part of the manifesto?
Yeah, this ecospheric studies is very much trying to look at the whole picture, not just at the ag part of it. Natural systems agriculture, this idea that they've developed at the land, is seen really more as a model than as the solution to everything, obviously. So it's a model for taking nature as measure, for recognizing that science and expertise has created most of the problems we're talking about, but it doesn't mean you give up on science, that the responsible use of science is part of solutions, yet solutions aren't easy. I mean, there's a lot that flows from it. And as you point out, the connections are everywhere. There are two big questions ecologically in this point. One is biodiversity loss, and the other is climate. And agriculture is connected to both of them. The greatest contributor to species extinction is agriculture. Right? So all of these, you can't deal with any of them separately, although we live in a world which, in some ways, the academy is the worst of it, encourages everybody to take their little slice of it and develop expertise. That's why I don't have any expertise. I'm resisting. Which is a polite way of saying I don't really know very much, but I can get away with it because I'm interdisciplinary.
My query is for you, Jensen. I appreciate your comments, and there's two questions in me about it. One is the place you spoke to the need for collective grieving, which I agree with.
Mm-hmm.
I also think there's a need for collective acknowledgement of other emotions that also arise in response to our current circumstances,
Mm-hmm.
right? So the most visible thing we tend to see in the collective is anger, right?
Yeah.
It's like, okay, here we are with this situation that partly has arisen politically due to the collective anger that was channeled, right?
Yeah.
But there's also fear that doesn't get acknowledged and gets sort of
Mm-hmm.
submerged and comes out in inappropriate ways. So one of my questions is about sort of like those other emotions
Yeah.
also. But my other and probably to me more important question is about, okay, so I acknowledge the need for collective grieving, and I come in enough of an alternative subculture that I occasionally even get to participate in people doing that together. And it's like it's this much of meeting that need, right? That needs to be more. So what form do you imagine that taking? How might that arise? Because it doesn't look to me like that collective grief is going to happen in this academic conference, right? So how does that happen then?
Well, we can assume that nothing really important happens at any academic conference. That goes without saying. So that's from somebody who's been doing this way too long. So I think the second question first. Obviously, the arts are far more useful, I think, as a vehicle for this connection and expression. So I was thinking of two things. One, my wife is a musician, a singer-songwriter, and her last 3 records have been all about this. And at her shows, when she moves into that part of her performance, you can see the change in the audience. And people open up in a way they, I think, often have been hungering for. Uh, I was just thinking of Octavia Butler's novel, The Parable of the Sower, which is probably the book I recommend the most to anybody who wants to deal with this. If you haven't read it, uh, it's really a stunning book. It's called science fiction dystopia, but it's really about this process. And there's actually been communities have formed around that book and her work. So it's through the arts, I think, we're most likely to connect. Although your point about churches is important also, because for all the problems that organized religion creates, it is still a place where people come to deal with this kind of thing. It's not seen as inappropriate to deal with this. And churches have two great advantages. They have buildings and they have rituals, which political movements have a hard time recreating. On the emotional questions, I think you're right. There's a lot of fear that's mobilized typically by reactionary right-wing forces. But I also think that good liberals often downplay fear. Well, we can't give in to fear. Well, I'm fucking terrified every day of my life. I wake up terrified. I go to bed terrified. I can't imagine any rational person not being terrified by what's happening in the world, especially over the last couple of centuries. Okay. So acknowledging fear instead of pretending that fear is only something to be mobilized by authoritarians is important. The anger, I think, is often grief avoidance. A lot of people get angry because they will not deal with the grief. And so I think grieving is often useful at reducing at least the uglier kinds of anger that can happen. That's some thoughts.
In my experience, there's a gender aspect
Oh, yeah.
of what you're describing.
Yeah.
And women are socialized to cover up our anger by grieving
Yeah.
instead. That's the safer, we can get teary,
Yes.
but we're not supposed to get pissed off.
Right.
Then typically, like, men I've known
Yeah.
are covering over their fear with anger, which for them is the socially acceptable
Yep.
form of expression. So it's a good.
It's an excellent point. It's overwhelmingly gendered like that, I think.
That's a great place to stop. Don't take off for lunch. Remember that lunch is going to be served here, and there's a fantastic plenary session planned for just a few minutes during the lunch break. Thanks, everyone, for coming.
Thanks, people. Appreciate it.
Well, I've been reading for a long time now, so can do that then to know.
It's only in recent years that
Yeah.
many companies
Yes, yes. And,
Yeah.
and
something close to
I didn't get into that
Yeah.
last night.
So please say hello to Betsy.
Well, so I find that like in this sort of setting, I don't care about, but like I've been a TA. Well, I mean, I've been teaching for the last few years now, and like I have absolutely no problem doing the thing in front of my students. It's just this where I'm like, oh, you're an expert, and you're supposed to tell people things. Like, what am I gonna tell you? I'm a theory nerd. I just talk about theory. Like, that's the
Yeah, I will.
things. That's
He's at 81. Yeah, yeah. And Wendell is about the same vintage. Yeah.
actual
So,
stage.
yeah, we got to get busy on this before he dies. Great.
Well, thank you very
Sorry,
much.
and I'm sorry I missed your talk.
These two we share.
Oh,
I think we all
tree. And where are you?
because
Where are you?
Jason wasn't here, we didn't really share.
I noticed And
Right.
and you know, kind of the older kind of conservative view, the don't go mucking with things that work.
Right.
Okay, that usually was a justification for having chassis systems, but
Right.
that
It's
idea that
talking about patriarchy, but it doesn't
yeah,
have to be talking about
I have a new
patriarchy.
book on patriarchy, so I'm particularly, in fact,
It's very
making some notes about the standard
well.
on
That's going to be
Greek
we're
because I actually feel that the
June 20th or
way
something.
that's gendered, I can't get into hyper-green easily.
Oh,
So when you
okay.
said that, I thought
Okay.
it was, but
Yeah.
there's the
Yeah.
other
in this book I just
the
published on feminism,
association
I
of
say, listen,
federation.
everybody who brings to me a proposal someday, I ask one question: does this help people create and maintain stable, decent human communities? Decent in terms of morals and not based on
Do you
prejudice,
like
but also
that? Do you
stable
like
in that they
this?
can,
Is part of
be
that?
around for a
Should
while.
Yeah.
You cannot wake up every morning and wonder if
around the same university?
the place
Oh,
that produces
oftentimes it's the same thing
and is part of
in my department.
liberal
So we go
capitalist
to
society.
conferences and
Right.
hang out,
Right.
And when the left celebrates
at
all of
home,
that, it's the destruction of
for
traditional
sure.
stuff
Take care of
and
transitions here.
makes
Yeah, no,
insupportable
definitely
countercyclicals
visited me
on the
looking
left.
to incorporate
The,
lots of
the rejection of rural communities, I think, is not appropriate
issues, not just around Ohio,
cultural or whatever it is,
but
which is he acknowledges is all true. There's real problems
my
with rural communities,
especially in the
but rural communities are communities.
but anyway,
Yeah, we had a great traveling. Like
that was good. I'm
we were
sad
all
the
kind of
back
looking
door.
around for
Right.
Renee,
So,
and then
see,
I
we
don't know.
found
right,
Melissa
he's,
Maher.
he has a lot of
Yeah.
Good,
experience
yeah,
Just jumped
thank you.
in.
And
in
I
office,
came in and I
so a lot of opportunities for him.
would have
But with humans, let alone the
you know, I got wait.
right? Like the character and the people.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
They've created, by the way, this
Honestly.
digression photo on that on
So
something
great.
called the
Well,
burial
that's my goal.
system,
Do you want to set up yours?
which was originally, I think, Sid Haus's paper, but his daughter is running it, and they're really trying to think about not just CSA farmer markets, but how do you actually make a viable farming community work, which means there have to be roads to make a living on.
Right.
And there's small miniature sisters on college courses this one initiative. And Catherine said was the laboratory for a new kind of communitology of thought
Where was that located?
in the same part of the world as that very center.
Yeah.
And
Ah,
and now they're looking for a new home for her children and really need young literature scholars on it.
oh, it's
Trying to find a new place, but really exciting alternatives. It's not major that you have to figure out how to
yeah. Let me get the
do
tech
it
guy.
and how can it become economically viable.
Right, right.
Yes.
Exactly.
I don't know.
Academics.
Let me get the tech guy, and I think hold on to this, and I'll send a name.
Yeah, there are also some new ways to
Yeah.
to this deeper set of questions we have to go.
There should be a website for this. You should
The whole thing?
download. Yeah, just you should be able to. I just want to check and make sure it's still working on that. But there's
This?
yep, and there's also the video option.
Is the video in?
No.
That's good.
Oh wait, there's no. Let's see if I can pull this down so it doesn't fluctuate those maps.
That good?
No, you're not. You're not.
Yeah.
Well, that looks like it's got good offset.
Huh?
Yeah. See, it's not pulling in and out of position.
Okay. All right, we good?
Great.
I'm gonna save this copy so it keeps that change.
Yeah. And then if we could just tell me what you pulled out of the file.
It's all. This is
Oh,
from
and then
here.
okay.
I do commend you on your superb packing and your due diligence.
By the way, you know this program to go full screen.
I do
Right, this little
commend
button
you
right
on
here.
your superb packing and your due diligence with all the.
You bet. I think yeah, it's already in there. All right, who?
Some popcorn, something new.
That.
Uh-huh.
All right, and nothing else. There's no.
Nope, nothing else.
Nothing feeds it like.
Nothing feeds it, no video. That always gets so tricky, you know.
So you have a clicker. So who's going first?
I believe she is.
And this is the clicker. It's got a laser. Forward, back, blank.
Uh, sorry, forward.
No, that's a
Oh,
laser.
sorry, forward, but and this is the laser pointer.
Mhm.
Okay, perfect. Okay.
Okay.
All right.
And this will
Can
be.
I take a look
Oh,
to
sure.
make sure?
This.
Yeah. That looks fine.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think we're good. Okay.
Wow. Okay.
So
Should be good.
when she's finished, then do you go to the next one or
No, you'll just hit escape out of this one.
hit escape?
Yeah, escape to get out of full screen, and then just open yours. And you know where the full screen button is on that?
No.
Oh, it's this little guy right here. So yours is just right to the right here, and so you'll just
Oh, just
put it
open it.
full screen,
Okay.
like that.
There we go.
Is that the
Yep.
beginning? Okay. All right, should be
Okay.
queued up.
All right. Thank you.
You bet. You'll both be presenting right here, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
right, welcome everybody. I'm going to get us going because timing is tight. So I want to welcome you all to our lunchtime session. I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Salma Monani. She is Associate Professor of Environmental Studies at Gettysburg College. She works on the environmental humanities, including film, literature, history, and communication. Her research explores the interconnections between culture and nature, particularly how various cultural media shape and are shaped by environmental issues. She has authored numerous articles and co-edited several volumes that are very relevant to our discussion at this conference. I'll just mention a couple of the edited volumes. Eco-Criticism in Indigenous Studies, Conversations from Earth to Cosmos, co-authored with co-edited with Johnny Adamson, and Eco-Cinema, Theory and Practice, and Eco-Media, Key Issues, co-edited with Stephen Rust and Sean Cubitt. Let us welcome Salma Monani, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina. And thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm delighted to be here. It's been really fun this morning and yesterday. And I have been told that I'm going to be yanked to 30 minutes. So I'm going to try to go a little bit fast over here. I want to start off by thanking the organizers, of course, for doing this, for putting this together. But there's a few other people that I want to acknowledge and thank, the indigenous peoples on whose lands we are, because a lot of my work is also, actually, as you'll see from this project, my work is all about indigenous cinema. So not only them, but I want to acknowledge all the indigenous filmmakers and producers that I work with. Particularly Terrell Calder, whose work I will talk about, and then the Imaginative Film and Media Festival, which I go to and have been going to now for a few years, 5 years now, which is up in Toronto. So I'll go ahead and start. I also should say that I have to apologize because this was me not getting the memo. As you all saw, this panel is called Eco-Criticism and Harmony, and this talk is not really about harmony. That was me not getting the memo. But if anything, I can say in ways in which to make it connect, it's really a talk about disharmony. And so this notion of life's wicked problems, it gets at that idea of disharmony. So to elaborate a little bit on what I mean by this disharmony, because it is something that is felt so strongly in so many indigenous communities all over the world, I'd like to open the talk with a short 3-minute clip from a movie by Terrell Calder, who's a Métis filmmaker and animator primarily, The Lodge. And here she is with her little animation on the side. And The Lodge is a film that premiered at the Imaginative Film Festival in 2014. Calder herself, I'm happy to say, I just heard she got nominated for the Ontario Indigenous Arts Council Award this year, so she's certainly a filmmaker who is up and coming and well known. She's from Winnipeg and the Treaty 1 lands. I want to set up the clip a little bit to give you a sense of what it's about. It's an animated feature. And it's about a character called Pearl, who you can see sort of sitting in this bucket over here. She's a British settler who arrives as a war bride in mid-20th century Canada, and she lives with her Métis husband in what she considers the Canadian wilds. As the clip will hopefully show, Pearl is really a character who is caught in between worlds. She's a woman attempting to overcome a humiliating past back in England, yet in doing so, she dehumanizes the indigenous peoples around her. And the animation, form allows Calder to show this literally in the form of animals. So even though this idea of dehumanizing might seem derogatory, what I want to say, and hopefully the clip will help you think about this a little bit more, is that Calder sets up Pearl as a very unreliable narrator, and as a consequence sets up some really interesting ways and critiques of sort of thinking about these ideas of animality, of race, of sexuality, and gender. So let's see if I can get my clip to work.
I do commend you on your superb packing and your due diligence with all the arrangements of Mother's fine china. It will be a splendid adornment in our grand new hunting lodge. Hunter will not rest until its magnificence would suit a queen. Hunter works endlessly, ensuring that I am well protected from the elements. He remains my loyal servant. But just like Mother's fine bone china, it started as nothing but a lump of muck. With a little care and patience, it was manipulated into a magnificent service. I provide a non-existent sense of class and structure that the locals have never before witnessed. They are simple, honest, timid people that can be rather lovely once they become familiar with you, once they trust you. If there ever comes a day when you tire of your solitude, Ruby, I implore you to come dig up a gem for yourself. The gold miners may have left the area, but spinsters are sure to find riches here. I'll say this about Canadian real estate. Their foundation is compiled of brute force, dedication, loyalty, and their lack of a proper education enables a delicate artisan to take hold of the base substance and create a truly malleable pet of a husband. Rest assured, I truly adore this new Canadian adventure that I've embarked on nearly 2 years ago. We dined to a sun